Hey folks, welcome to chapter 10, where we talk about brain damage and neuroplasticity, all about how your brain can change and recover from damage. And for your opening slide, I have some images of kintsugi skulls. These are skulls that are repaired with gold leaf, which is a Japanese technique for repairing pottery. Here it's used to recover a skull. I thought this was a nice uh, set of art for this chapter. So as your overview, we're going to talk about neurogenesis and neuroplasticity as general concepts. Then we're going to talk about different ways that the brain can get damaged through tumors, strokes, closed head injuries, infections, and neurotoxins, and then also a variety of disorders from epilepsy, Parkinson's, MS, and Alzheimer's disease. So we'll spend some time on the damage and disorders, and then finally, we're going to talk about recovery. So how does your brain reorganize and rehabilitate, and how can we facilitate that process? So first, we return to the idea of neurogenesis, which actually we brought up last week, or last chapter, in chapter 9 when we talked about development, where we said that most brain development wasn't new neurons being formed, though they can in certain places. Most brain development is involved in myelination and forming new synapses and that sort of thing. The idea of neurogenesis, of course, is the idea that new neurons are formed. They proliferate and form in utero at high rates, but are much less common. Neurogenesis is much less common in adults, or at least adult humans. We can get neurogenesis, development of new neurons, particularly in the peripheral nervous system. So if you damage a neuron out to your finger, sometimes you can grow a new neuron to innervate your skin cells, and you can get neurogenesis in the hippocampus. After birth, neural death is much more common than neurogenesis. We talked about that last time. So when we talk about later brain development and later brain recovery, we're going to be talking much more about neuroplastic changes than we are neurogenesis. Neuroplasticity is the general idea that your brain is not static, it's plastic, it's moldable and changeable. So your brain undergoes continuous growth and change in response to the environment and in response to experiences. Some version of this involve rearranging your neural connections, so changing or adding connections, synapses and dendrites. We'll talk about this later in the chapter. In the next chapter that follows, when we talk about memory, talk about long-term potentiation, where the connections between neurons get strengthened. This is a plastic change as your neurons don't form new, brand new through neurogenesis when you learn something, but the connections change. So this is neuroplasticity. And then myelination is a form of neuroplasticity as our neurons are changing in terms of their efficiency and the myelin that surrounds them. So our brains don't undergo a lot of neurogenesis after birth, but they are plastic. And some of those changes are not necessarily for the good. You can have pathological plasticity where your brain can be damaged caused by many factors. There's a list below, and we're going to walk through them individually. So one way that we can get brain damage is through tumors. Tumors are a group of cells growing independently from the rest of the body. They can, in the brain, they can be encapsulated, which means that they're sort of a tumor sort of growing by themselves, like in a capsule like this, or they can be infiltrating, where they're moving throughout the brain to neural cells and not just in one ball. They can be in glio. These are called gliomas, or they can be between the meninges. These are meningiomas. Okay? And you can see some of these here is the as this tumor is encapsulated, and this is a meningioma with tumor cells along the meninges. You can get brain tumors in starting from other organs. So tumor doesn't necessarily have to start in the brain. They can progress as cancer cells spread from, say, the lungs, because our brain needs oxygen, and so cells from your lungs can make it through your bloodstream up into your brain and start brain tumors there. So these independent growing cells can form in or around the brain and can cause a lot of problems because we don't have a system for attacking these cells. Another form of damage to the brain that's pretty common is stroke. Stroke is a cerebrovascular disorder. So vascular system is your blood system, right? And cerebro is your head, right? So it's blood to your brain, and it's sudden. So it's not like a gradual disorder. It's a sudden event, right? There are two types of strokes that you should be able to differentiate. One is a hemorrhage or hemorrhagic stroke, where a blood vessel actually bursts and then the blood pools on the brain. Blood pooling on the brain causes direct damage to the brain. Like say you have an aneurysm and the blood bursts, that's a hemorrhagic stroke. The blood pools on the brain and causes damage, and you get damage to your brain that way. It's quite dangerous. The other type of stroke that you may be more familiar with is an ischemic stroke, ischemia, where the blood supply is disrupted. You can actually see an ischemia here in this image, the CT scan, where this blood vessel is like tightened up here, right? So blood can't flow through this blood vessel. Typically, ischemias occur because arteries are plugged with thrombosis or embolism. You need to know those terms if you're in my class, but the arteries get plugged, usually because the blood vessel walls are thickened with fat. So fat fills up the blood vessels along the walls, and it becomes difficult for blood to flow through. There's only a small amount of space for it to flow through, and then those arteries are easier to plug because they're partially filled with fat. So blood pooling on your brain or blood not reaching your brain can both cause brain damage. Now, why is it that blood vessels being blocked leads to brain damage? Why do ischemic strokes lead to brain damage? Well, counterintuitively, it's actually due to overexcitation of your neurons. Sometimes you might think, oh, you have a lack of blood flow, your brain stops being active, and therefore you get brain damage, but it's actually the opposite. Neurons affected by ischemia release glutamate in response, almost to compensate, and then the extra glutamate that flows through causes excitation of the following neurons, and those neurons will die. And you get a cascading effect where this just continues from neuron to neuron. So the longer the blockage maintains, the longer you're going to get this overexcitation, and the longer the cascade of damage is going to occur. So it's important to identify an ischemic stroke quickly. The next source of brain damage are closed head injuries. So my head's closed, my skull's not open, but I get an injury from the skull. There's a few different types of closed head injuries. The first is a contusion caused by the brain hitting the skull, which results in a bruise. Now, you may know that a bruise on your skin looks the color it does because there's blood pooling, right? Well, we already know how dangerous blood pooling on the brain is from hemorrhagic strokes, right? So if brain damage actually causes blood to pool on the brain, you get an effect kind of similar to a stroke, and that can cause severe brain damage and oftentimes death. A concussion is when you get an injury to the head that disrupts consciousness but doesn't lead to a contusion. Okay, so if you have damage to your head that actually leads to blood pooling or a bruise, that's no longer a concussion, it would be a contusion. But concussions can be dangerous too. They're just not as immediately dangerous in terms of the blood pooling up from the hematoma. We know that concussions can have long-lasting effects on cognition, on motor movement, on neurological function, as that force can cause brain damage even if there isn't blood pooling up. There's a third condition related to closed head injuries called CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Chronic means over time, it continues to happen. This is when you get a buildup of protein tangles and you get symptoms that progress over time with repeated concussions. So one concussion can cause long-term changes, but repeated concussions are more likely to lead to long-term changes of the CTE type. There's just a bit of data from 2015 comparing the brains of retired football players who've had multiple concussions and patients with Alzheimer's disease who are significantly older than them versus control participants who didn't have concussions or Alzheimer's disease. And what they're measuring here in a PET scan is measuring protein buildup. And you can see that the buildup of these protein tangles looks similar in people who are football players as it does in people with Alzheimer's disease. And you get some similar symptoms in terms of memory and cognitive impairment, emotional control impairment, that kind of thing. So repeated concussions can lead to buildup of protein in a similar way that Alzheimer's disease can. Last source of brain damage comes from infections. Well, we got two more, sorry. The next source of brain damage is from infections. This can lead to inflammation. When you get an infection, it leads to inflammation like of your lungs, which is why you cough, right? In the brain, if you get an infection in the brain, it can inflame the brain itself, which is encephalitis, or it can inflame the meninges, which is meningitis. You can get infections from bacteria, from viruses, and from other organisms like Aspergillus, which is a fungus. Sorry, Aspergillus is a fungus. Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite that lives in cats, actually. And these can all cause damage to the brain, inflammation and damage to the brain itself, or inflammation to the meninges, which then can cause damage to the brain next door. The final source of brain damage are neurotoxins. A neurotoxin has a very specific definition, which is a substance that is destructive to nerve tissue. So sometimes you'll hear the term toxin, or there's like toxins in my food, and people just mean something that's not healthy for you. To be a neurotoxin, it needs to actually cause brain damage, not just be not good for your brain. It has to be something that can get to your brain as well, so it has to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Some neurotoxins come from substance use, particularly during development. You get more neurotoxic effects if you're consuming a variety of psychoactive substances during development are more likely to have destructive effects. Fetal alcohol syndromes are an example of that, where drinking during pregnancy can cause destruction to developing nerve tissue and other structures of the body and leads to neurological developmental deficits. You can also get neurotoxic effects from certain drugs that can lead to a condition called tardive dyskinesia. Certain antipsychotic drugs can cause brain damage with repeated use, and then you get brain damage in your movement centers, your dopamine neurons, and so then you end up with tardive dyskinesia, which is repetitive movements or issues with movement control more generally. And that's due to neurotoxic effects of some drugs. Neurotoxins also come in the form of heavy metals, which are dense metals like arsenic, cadmium, lead, or mercury. It's not good to be exposed to lots of arsenic, cadmium, lead, or mercury. One of the effects you can get is toxic psychosis, where you get psychotic symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, and that sort of thing caused by toxins. This is actually where the term Mad Hatter or Mad as a Hatter comes from Alice in Wonderland. Um, Hatters used to use mercury as a substance to put a shine on their hats. And because of that, some people in the hat making industry would develop toxic psychosis. And they didn't necessarily know why. It turned out it was a mercury that was doing it. Heavy metals like mercury or lead in your water, for example, can lead to issues with brain development, as neurons are less likely to survive or less likely to draw the connections as you develop. Um, Removing heavy metals, like removing lead or removing arsenic from paint, removing lead from water, from gas and paint, um, seem to have positive influences on cognition and brain development over time.